Hello everyone, good morning. So today I will be guiding you through, as Heather said, our report, which is basically on the future of the Arctic. And our report is called the Arctic Handbook. I will guide you through it. So I'm from Polarisk. Polarisk is the first and only so far, maybe it will change in the future, but only so far, consultancy that's working on microeconomics and political risk in the Arctic and Antarctic only. What we do today is basically trying to understand where is the Arctic going in the time of climate change. Basically, this is a session about what's going to be happening in 20 years in the Arctic. But what has happened in the past 20 years? Well, on that slide you saw how the Arctic is going to change from a climatology perspective between 1995, when the Arctic Council did not exist, and 2035. But as we put in the Arctic Handbook, it goes much beyond climatology and climate change and everything. I'm going to present you what we and what other people think of the world in 2035. So let me start with a couple of figures. So first of all, what is going to be the world population in 2035? Well, the UN says between 8 and 9 billion people. Then what is going to be the global GDP in 2035? Well, in 2015, next year, it's going to be, according to the IMF, 81 trillions. Well, in 2035, it will be 210 trillions. If we think about energy, what is going to be the global primary energy demand around the world? Well, technically, from now on to 2035, BP forecasts an increase by 42% of the demand. And just another one, what's going to be the oil price in 2035? If you think about the Arctic, we of course think about natural resources, oil and gas exploration, and so on. Well, technically, if we keep business as usual, well, the barrel of oil will cost $135. Well, if we implement new policies at the global level, it could go down to $113. Well, if we stand to 450 scenarios, so a scenario in which we as the world, we implement new policies, but also new technologies that will help reduce our carbon footprint, then the barrel of oil would be $90 in 2035. So that's from the IEA. And then you have one last thing. How does climate change and change in the Arctic express itself from a geostrategic, a geopolitical, and a geoeconomic perspective? Well, that's what we are answering in the report. So technically, when we think about the Arctic in 2035, there is one coin word to remember. Sisungutinik, which means adaptation, or to adapt oneself, in Inuktitut. And we're going to be talking about adaptation today. So what we see in the Arctic is two phases of development. The first phase is the phase between 2015 and 2025 to 28, which we call the Arctic construction era, in which we see a development of infrastructure, development of institutions, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. And then between 2025, 28, and 2013 and beyond, you have the Arctic boom era. The Arctic boom era from a political perspective, from an economic perspective, and from an innovation perspective. We'll be dealing with that. So the first thing we had to do is develop a definition of the Arctic market. What is the Arctic market right now? Well, the Arctic market, you could argue, and I think our fellows here will argue, that it limits itself to the Arctic countries. Well, we go much beyond that, actually. What we did was develop a new geoeconomic-based definition of what the Arctic market will be in 2035. And so in order to compare numbers between 2035 and 2015, well, you'll see the difference it makes between $620 billion today at GDP to up to $2 trillion in 2035. But what is the Arctic market? So the Arctic market is not just the Arctic countries. Of course, you have Alaska, you have Greenland, Kalaalleq, you have Iceland, you have Finland, which is the only European country that says that its whole territory is an Arctic territory because it's above the 60 degrees latitude. And then you have other kind of players like the Faroe Islands, like France with the Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon archipelago. You have Sweden, you have Russia, and you have parts of northeast China. We will get into it. This is what it looks like. The Arctic market right now well, in 2035, but that we've started studying right now, looks like this. And so we're going to be providing you 2 case studies today. So the first one is shipping. As it interests a lot of people, well, what we see is that in 2035, there could be kind of weekly service between Murmansk and Tianjin. Of course, that's a little bit provocative to put it like this, but from a more serious perspective here, this is what the Arctic shipping series will look like in 2035. So, of course, you have the Northern Sea route on the Russian side, you have the Arctic Bridge between North America and Europe, and then you have the Northwest Passage in Canada. But you have also these transpolar routes, which cannot be used today because there's too much ice on the road. And you have people like the NVGL, like the European Commission, who have tried to assess the number of ships that would go through these routes that cannot be sailed today. But what are the figures for 2014 as a reference? So the figures are simple, and that's from October 14. Well, as of October 14, there were 28 transits on the Northern Sea route, held by Rosatomflot. Well, the season is not ended, of course, and we expect, at Polarisk, we estimate that there might be a 29 to 32 transits this year, which is a dramatic decrease compared to last year. A dramatic decrease which is not explained by politics, which is not explained by economics per se. It's basically very simple. There was just too much ice on the Northern Sea route this year. But nonetheless, by 2035, we expect to see more than 30 new Arctic-related hubs. What we call Arctic-related hubs can be global hubs, like Murmansk, for example, like Kirkenes, but it can be also local hubs. So here in Iceland, we'll see 3 main hubs emerging. Reykjavik, of course, Akureyri, of course, and Finnafjörður, which is developing right now. But beyond the Icelandic fate in the Arctic, of course, you have a lot of ports, harbors that will be developed in Russia and in many other parts of the Arctic, as you can see. So, going to our figures in 2035, what we see at Polarisk is that up to 19% of Chinese exports could go through the Arctic. We can discuss this figure later, I guess, because China in the Arctic and China in the Arctic shipping sector will be a major issue or a major newcomer in the years to come. What we see as well is that we can expect up to 50% market share on north-north shipments. That is, on shipments that come from a harbor that's north of the 40 degrees parallel north, and that go to another harbor that's above the 14 degrees parallel as well. And another thing, a lot of people say that the NSR, the Northwest Passage, could have a strong impact on Panama, on Suez, and all that. What we see is that the impact would be very little. The reason to this is very simple. It's not just because in the Arctic you won't have that much cargo and you will have more bulk and all that, but the main thing to understand is that the Arctic will not cannibalize the Suez and Panama markets. The Arctic will create its own market with its own players and will basically expand the global shipping market rather than cannibalizing another part of the world. And so we're basically aligned when it comes to, we're basically aligned with the European Commission and with the NVGL when we think about how many ships could sail through the Arctic by 2035. Well, we think about more than 2,000 could be a good figure. And again, just to finish with shipping, the main hubs, what would the main hubs would be? Well, Murmansk-Kirkenes is an absolute reality. And it's emerging right now, since we are in the Arctic construction era. But then you have another hub that is Iceland. And we'll get to it in the conclusion. Iceland is not just a sum of hubs that will happen. As I said, there's going to be 3 main hubs, main harbor in Iceland. No, it's just Iceland itself can be the hub. But beyond shipping, so what we have also is new technologies, new sectors that emerge in the Arctic. So the first one can be farming. What you see here is Greenland. That's kind of counterintuitive. Well, basically, what you can expect is that you have a lot more farming and growing that happens in the Arctic as global warming arises. Then the second thing is the fiber optic sector, the data center sector. And again, Iceland, Greenland, Finland, a lot of countries in the Arctic can benefit from that sector. That's quite lucrative. Another one, which will mostly benefit to Svalbard, Greenland, or even Alaska, could be the space sector. And we can get to that again later on. But beyond that, as I said, there's going to be new innovations. And new innovations can take many forms. Well, we've spotted a couple of companies, new young entrepreneurs, that are actually building some very interesting things for the Arctic. What you see here is the Arctic Floating City project by a young Canadian who basically said, well, why don't we put some autonomous cities in the international waters of the Arctic? Why don't we do that? And then you have another French team of students who said, well, what we could do is basically harvest iceberg within a structure that's man-made and then develop many things out of that. Well, what we see is that there will be a lot of new sectors, new industries that will emerge in the Arctic, and we try to quantify the emergence of those in our report. And there is one key other thing when it comes to geopolitics. I will get into the Russian question to end this talk, but the other great political thing in the Arctic is Greenland, or otherwise known as Kalalit Nunaat. Will it be independent? Can it be independent? Well, what we see is that if Greenland builds an economic strategy, an economic recipe that is sound, sustainable, and that makes use of all these new industries that are going to be emerging in the Arctic, and if it can use the West Nordic framework to actually develop itself regionally speaking, if it can develop a strong hedging strategy at a global level, thanks to uranium, thanks to many things, well, Greenland could very well be independent by 2035. Because what we're building here is scenarios. At Polaris, we work out of 7 scenarios, and then an 8th one, which we will get into, I think, during the discussion. But so the message that's important beyond this idea of adaptation is that the Arctic is really what you make of it, and that's why we work out of scenarios. We cannot predict. No one can predict. What we can say is that you, as Arctic stakeholders, you can make use of those scenarios to either follow them, if you're interested in them, or actually impact them, to change the Arctic to make it look like what you would like. So that's kind of what the Russians are doing right now. And the Primakov Doctrine is kind of a new term that we're trying to coin in the report. Basically, it's based on the work of Yevgeny Primakov. And basically, he was the one, around the years 1997, 1998, who said, well, this idea that Russia should copy the West just doesn't match the Russian society. And so Russia should be independent in its foreign policy. He didn't say that Russia should be imperialistic, expansionist. He said that it should be independent and think independently. And well, as we see on this map, if Russia actually builds all the SNR and military centers that it wants to build, that President Putin has announced in the Arctic, well, its projection capability could be strong in the Arctic. But we don't say that when it comes to China and Russia coming to the Arctic, it's going to be for a military showdown. Of course, the Chinese military expenditure by 2035 can reach, at current trends, 100% of that of the US. And that's, of course, a very strong element to take into account when we study defense and security related investments in the Arctic up to 2035. We have 3 scenarios. You have the numbers over here. Well, basically, scenario 5, we'll get into that, is the militarization one. But that's not the one that's actually the most robust. Bottom line is, in 2035, this may be more than just an exercise. There will not be a war for the Arctic, but should there be a conflict, it can very well happen in the Arctic at some point. And that's why we need cooperation, and the Arctic Council is doing a great work. On the side, you have the timeline of the Arctic Council chairmanships, and you have potential new applicants. When we say potential new applicants, it's people that we have identified as new applicants, or people who are actually building their program right now, and which will send their application in the next years to come. So you can see that you have many countries, of course not from the Arctic, but not even from the near or subarctic. So what it is all about is mutations. Mutations in every kind of way. So in the report, the Polaris Arctic Handbook 2015 edition, we guide you through those mutations. And we hope that the figures that we've put in the report can actually help you stakeholders, whether you're from an economic background, whether you're an administration, whether you're a country, whatever, can help you understand where the Arctic is going so that you can act on it. So basically, it's available right now on our website, polarisk-group.com/shop. And today, if you buy it in the next few days, actually, if you use the coupon Arctic Circle, you will get 20% rebate. Yeah, it's good. It's good to say it, right? And I would like to conclude this discussion and hand the floor back to our panelists, our mighty panelists, by talking about Iceland just for a very, very short time. Yes, in 2035, this Arctic land, because it's not a subarctic land, is a world-class hub. It is a world-class hub. And that's what we're seeing. That's why we are building geoeconomic perspectives for the Arctic and for Iceland. And we're very glad, very, very glad, and thank you again, President Grimson, and all those who've made it possible that we are presenting this groundbreaking work today here in Iceland. Thank you very much.